The morning my son pinned that white coat onto his shoulders, I was standing in the back row of the auditorium. Not because I arrived late, not because I forgot to reserve a seat, but because his future mother-in-law had quietly rearranged the family seating chart the night before, and somehow, the woman who had worked double nursing shifts for 23 years to put her boy through school ended up behind a pillar, straining to see his face. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself the only thing that mattered was watching Daniel walk across that stage. But when she leaned over to the woman beside her loud enough that I could hear and said, "That's the mother." She was just a hospital aide, you know. Barely finished high school, something shifted in my chest. Something that had been patient for a very long time stopped being patient. She had no idea who I was, and I had been waiting 18 months to show her. My name is Margaret. I am 64 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom house in Guelph, Ontario, the same house I bought on my own in 1997 after my husband Raymond passed from a heart attack at 41, leaving me with a 7-year-old boy, a mortgage I could barely afford, and a grief so heavy I had to portion it out in small pieces just to function. Raymond was a mining safety inspector. He loved his work. He believed that the people underground deserved someone paying attention, someone who would stand up and say, "This isn't right. These men need protection." He died 14 months after being let go from his position at a company called Norfield Resource Group, a dismissal that was never properly explained, that came with no severance, and that my husband believed until the end was retaliation for a safety report he had filed. I could never prove it. I tried. I wrote letters. I called the Ministry of Labor. I was told the matter had been reviewed and closed. Raymond's name appeared nowhere in the public record. He became a footnote in a story that was never told. So I raised Daniel alone. I worked as a registered nursing assistant at Guelph General for 16 years, then completed my RPN certification at night while Daniel was in middle school, sitting at the kitchen table with my textbooks while he did his homework across from me. We studied together most evenings. He knew what each year cost me. He never once took it for granted. When Daniel was accepted to McMaster's medical program, I sat in the car in the hospital parking lot after my shift and cried for 40 minutes. Not from sadness. From something I didn't have a word for, a feeling like a debt being repaid by the universe, slowly, in its own time. He met Priya in his 2nd year of residency. She was a physiotherapist, sharp and kind, with a laugh that arrived before she did. I liked her immediately. I liked the way she looked at my son, not at what he was becoming, but at who he already was. Her parents were another matter. Her father, Dr. Harlan Whitmore, was a retired cardiovascular surgeon who had built a private clinic network across southern Ontario. He drove a car that cost more than my first mortgage. He spoke in the measured, slightly bored tone of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged in a room. Her mother, Constance, coordinated charity galas and served on 3 hospital foundation boards and owned opinions about everything, delivered as though they were facts that lesser minds had simply failed to grasp yet. The first time we met, at a dinner in their home in Oakville, Constance asked me where I had completed my training. When I told her, she nodded in the way that people nod when they are filing information under a category they consider minor. She spent the rest of the evening asking Daniel questions. Over the following months, there were small things. The way she described Daniel's accomplishments to her friends, as though Priya had cultivated him from raw material. The way she referred to my house in Guelph as cozy with a pause before the word that made it mean something else. The way she once asked, in front of Daniel, whether I had looked into any retirement planning because it was something one really had to start thinking about. Daniel would look at me afterward with an apology in his eyes. I would squeeze his hand and tell him it was fine. It was fine. I was not a woman who broke easily. And I had not spent 23 years building something just to let a woman like Constance Whitmore make me feel small about it. But I had also, by that point, been sitting on something for almost a year. It started with a name. Priya's parents had hosted a dinner to celebrate Daniel, matching to his fellowship, a dinner I was invited to, and seated at the far end of the table, near the kitchen door, while Constance held court at the other end. Harlan made a toast. He mentioned, in passing, that his father had also been in resource development in northern Ontario, that it was a different era then, that the industry had built this province. I set down my fork. I asked, carefully, which company his father had been associated with. Harlan said, with the faint pride of a man reciting a legacy, that his father had been on the board of Norfield Resource Group through the late 80s and 90s. I said nothing. I picked up my fork. I ate the rest of my meal. That night I drove back to Guelph with my hands very steady on the wheel and my mind doing something it had not done in years, reaching back into a filing cabinet I had sealed shut a long time ago, pulling out folders I had not opened since Daniel was in primary school. Raymond's safety report had cited pressure from Norfield's board to suppress findings related to ventilation failures at their Sudbury operation. He had documented everything. He had named names. His supervisor had assured him the report would be filed with the ministry. It was never filed. Raymond was dismissed 3 weeks later. 6 months after that, there was a partial collapse at that same site. 2 workers were injured. The company paid a small fine, admitted nothing, and the incident was recorded as a mechanical failure. Raymond died 14 months after losing his job. The stress, the humiliation, the feeling of having tried to do the right thing and been erased for it, I watched that eat him from the inside. I know what killed my husband. It was not his heart. I had kept copies of everything. Raymond's original report, his correspondence with his supervisor, the internal emails he had printed before he was escorted from the building, a letter he had drafted to the ministry that was never sent because he ran out of time. I also had, in a folder at the back of the filing cabinet, a list of names Raymond had noted as being present at a board meeting where the decision to dismiss him had been made. One of those names was Gerald Whitmore, Harlan's father. I did not go to the white coat ceremony planning to do anything. I want to be clear about that. I had spent months deciding whether to do anything at all. Daniel was happy. Priya was good for him. Whatever Gerald Whitmore had done, Harlan was not his father, and Priya was not Harlan. But when Constance said what she said, barely finished high school, just a hospital aide, something inside me made a decision that my conscious mind was still catching up with. Because here is what Constance did not know. In the 8 months since that dinner in Oakville, I had not been sitting quietly. I had contacted a journalist named Susan Callow, who wrote investigative pieces for a Toronto publication focused on labor and workplace safety. I had sent her Raymond's documents. She had found 3 other former Norfield employees who had similar stories. She had spent 6 months verifying, cross-referencing, building. Her piece was complete. It had been complete for 3 weeks, waiting for one final piece of legal clearance before publication. I had also, on the advice of Susan's editor, filed a formal complaint with the Ontario Ministry of Labour's Historical Grievance Office, a mechanism created in 2019 for exactly these situations, cases where documentation existed but had never been properly reviewed. That process was ongoing. Constance did not know any of this. She thought she was whispering about a woman who had worked hospital shifts and raised a son and arrived at a ceremony in a department store blazer. She thought she knew the shape of me. The ceremony ended. There were photographs, champagne in plastic flutes, Harlan shaking hands with the program director in a way that suggested he considered them colleagues. Constance organized a group dinner at a restaurant in downtown Hamilton, a good restaurant, the kind with a wine list and linen napkins. She had made the reservation for 12. She had seated me, I discovered when we arrived, between Daniel's residency coordinator and a cousin of Priya's who had flown in from Calgary. I was not at the family table. I was at what I privately thought of as the courtesy table. Daniel found me before we sat down. He said, quietly, that he was sorry. He said he had not seen the seating arrangement until that moment. I told him the truth, that it was all right, and that I needed him to trust me tonight. He looked at me for a long moment. He knows my face the way you only know a face when it is the first face you ever really studied. He nodded. Harlan stood to make a toast partway through the meal. He was good at toasts. He talked about legacy, about the long tradition of medicine in both families. He paused there, in the way people pause when they want an omission to be noticed, about the kind of dedication it takes to reach this moment. He thanked his wife. He thanked Priya. He turned toward Daniel and said that he was proud to welcome him into a family that understood what it meant to build something that lasts. He sat down. The table applauded. I stood up. I want to describe what happened in that room, because it mattered. Constance looked up with an expression of polite surprise that was really not polite at all. Harlan's face arranged itself into the careful neutrality of a man deciding how to manage an interruption. Daniel went very still. I said that I also wanted to say a few words, if the table would allow it. I said that I was Daniel's mother, that I had raised him alone in Guelph on a nursing salary, that we had studied at the same kitchen table, that I had watched him become, over 23 years, the most honest and careful person I had ever known, and that I was more proud of him than I had language for. I paused. I said that I also wanted to speak briefly about legacy, since the word had come up. I said that my late husband Raymond had also believed in building something that lasts, that he had been a mining safety inspector, that he had filed a report in 1991 documenting ventilation failures at a Norfield Resource Group operation in Sudbury, and that he had been dismissed from his position shortly after, and that the report had never been submitted to the ministry, as required by law. The room was very quiet. I said that Raymond had kept documentation of everything. That I had kept that documentation for 33 years. That I had recently been in contact with a journalist at a Toronto publication who had spent 6 months investigating the matter, and that I had also filed a formal complaint with the Ontario Ministry of Labour's Historical Grievance Office. I looked at Harlan. I said that I understood his father had served on Norfield's board during the relevant period. I said I wanted him to know that I bore no ill will toward him personally, and that I did not believe children were responsible for their parents' choices. But I wanted him to understand who I was. Not a hospital aide who had barely finished high school, a woman who had spent 33 years keeping the evidence of what had been done to her family, and who had finally found the right moment and the right help to do something with it. I said that the article would be published within the month. I said that I looked forward to the story being told correctly, for the first time. Then I said that I loved my son very much, and that I wished him and Priya every happiness, and I sat down. The silence lasted long enough to be uncomfortable for everyone except me. Constance was the first to speak. Her voice was controlled in the way that voices are controlled when the person using them is not in control. She said that this was hardly the appropriate occasion. I agreed with her pleasantly. I said that she was right, and that I had originally intended to say nothing, but that something she had said at the ceremony had changed my mind. She asked what I meant. I told her exactly what I had heard her say, and I told her when she had said it, and I watched the calculation move across her face as she tried to determine whether I was bluffing or whether I had actually been 3 rows behind her. I had not been bluffing. I had heard every word. Daniel reached across the table and put his hand over mine. What happened in the weeks that followed was complicated in the way that true things are complicated when they have been compressed for a long time and finally have room to expand. Susan's article was published 22 days later. It ran long. It named Norfield, named the board members from the relevant period, traced the pattern across 4 dismissed employees and 1 unreported incident. Gerald Whitmore's name appeared in the documentation as a board member present at the meeting where the decision to reclassify Raymond's report had been made. Gerald had died in 2008. Harlan was not mentioned in the article. He had nothing to answer for legally. But he called me. He called me 11 days after the article ran. He spoke for a long time. He said he had not known. He said his father had not discussed the business with the family. He said he did not expect me to believe him, and he was not asking me to forgive anything, because he understood that what had been done was not his to ask forgiveness for. He said that if there was anything, and he left that open in a way that told me he had spent a long time thinking about what to say. I told him that the only thing I had ever wanted was for Raymond's name to be in the record, to have it acknowledged that he had done his job correctly, and that he had been punished for it. The ministry's grievance process concluded 4 months later with a formal acknowledgement that Raymond's 1,991 report should have been submitted and was not, and that his dismissal appeared to have been retaliatory in nature. It was a bureaucratic document. It was also the most important piece of paper I had received since Daniel's acceptance letter. I had it framed. It hangs in my hallway, next to a photograph of Raymond in his work gear, squinting into the sun, smiling. Priya and Daniel were married the following spring, in a small ceremony at a conservation area outside Guelph. Priya's parents attended. Constance was polite to me in the careful way of a person who has recalibrated their understanding of a situation. She did not try to move my seat. I was in the front row. There was a moment during the reception when Harlan came and sat beside me. We didn't talk about any of it. We talked about Daniel, about the first time Harlan had met him, about a fishing trip the two of them had apparently taken in the fall, about the way Daniel listened when people talked to him, like he was genuinely interested in what they had to say. I told Harlan that was Raymond, that Raymond had listened to people that way, that Daniel had learned it from watching his father in those first 7 years and had carried it without knowing he was carrying it. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Raymond sounded like someone worth knowing. I said that he was exactly that. There are things I wish I had done differently. I wish I had pushed harder when Daniel was young, before I was tired, before the letters stopped being answered. I wish Raymond had lived to see his son in a white coat. I wish that the right moment for justice had come 30 years earlier, when it would have done Raymond some good. But I have learned, in 64 years, that the right moment arrives when it arrives. You can be ready for it or you can let it pass. I had been ready for a long time. I had kept the documents. I had kept Raymond's handwriting. I had kept the name. When my son was 7 years old and asking me why his daddy wasn't coming home from work anymore, I told him that his father had been a good man who had tried to do the right thing. I told him that the right thing is worth doing, even when it costs you. Daniel has never forgotten that. I know he hasn't, because I have watched him practice medicine the way his father practiced integrity, carefully, without shortcuts, with his attention fully on the person in front of him. I did not raise a doctor. I raised Raymond's son. The doctor is just what that became. And if Constance Whitmore is listening, I did finish high school. I finished it in 1979, with honors, in a town outside Thunder Bay where the winters lasted 8 months, and the guidance counselor told me that girls from families like mine didn't usually go into healthcare. I went into healthcare anyway. I stayed in it for 38 years. I raised a boy who will spend his life trying to keep people alive. I know exactly who I am. I always have. I was simply waiting for the right moment to introduce myself. The beeping was the only sound I remember clearly. Not voices, not footsteps, not the sound of a door opening, just that steady mechanical beeping that told me I was still alive. When I opened my eyes, the first face I saw was a nurse I'd never met before, a young woman with dark hair pulled back tight, checking something on a clipboard. She looked up and said, "Oh good, you're awake." She said it the way you'd say it to anyone, a stranger, which, to her, I was. I didn't know where I was for about 30 seconds. Then I felt the ivy in my arm, the stiffness in my chest, the particular silence of a hospital room at 4 in the morning, and I knew. I thought about my daughter. My first thought even then was her. I want to be honest about who I was before all this happened. I was the kind of mother who never wanted to be a burden. 63 years old, living alone in my house in Kelowna since my husband Raymond passed 4 years ago. 2 bedrooms, a small backyard that still had his garden boxes in it that I'd never had the heart to take apart. I worked part-time at the library for years. I volunteered at St. Andrew's on Sunday mornings. I kept busy. I never complained. I told myself that was strength. My daughter, she's 36, lives in Calgary with her husband and their son. She called maybe once a week, sometimes less. When she did call, it was usually while she was doing something else. I could hear it in her voice, that distracted quality, like she was sorting mail or scrolling through her phone while I talked. I told myself that was just modern life. That's what I told myself every time I noticed something that hurt. We had a difficult few years after Raymond died. She thought I should sell the house and move closer to them. I didn't want to. I'd lived in Kelowna for 30 years. My friends were here. My church was here. She said I was being stubborn. I said I was being honest about what I needed. We found a kind of peace about it eventually, or at least I thought we did. That Sunday morning in October, I felt off from the moment I got up. A strange heaviness in my chest, an ache in my left arm that I kept telling myself was from sleeping wrong. I went to church anyway. We were halfway through the second hymn when everything just narrowed. The room got very small and very bright at the same time, and then I don't remember anything else. I was told later that 2 women from the congregation caught me before I hit the floor. One of them, a woman named Beverly, who I knew only to wave at, rode with me in the ambulance. She held my hand the whole way, even though she barely knew me. I think about that a lot. The doctor on call tried my daughter first. Her number was in my wallet on a card I'd made up years ago. The kind of thing you do when you get to a certain age and start thinking about these things. He called her 31 times between 7:15 and 10 o'clock that morning. 31 times. I know, because he told me himself 2 days later with a look on his face that he was trying very hard to keep professional. She didn't answer once. They reached my nephew eventually, my sister's son, who lives in Penticton, about an hour away. He was there within 2 hours. He sat with me the first night without being asked. He's 28 years old and he rearranged his whole week for me, this young man who I used to babysit when he was small and who still calls me auntie, even though he's long past the age when he needs to. I was in and out for the first day. A cardiac event, they said. Not a full heart attack, but serious enough. A stent procedure, rest, monitoring. When I was more fully conscious by the second morning, my nephew told me they still hadn't reached my daughter. I asked him to keep trying. I still wanted her there, even then. She called at 11:40 on the second night. I was awake when the nurse came in to tell me. She'd seen the missed calls, she said. She'd been in Tofino with her husband and their son for a long weekend. Bad service, she said. She was so sorry, she said. She would drive up as soon as she could, she said. I said, that's okay, get some rest first. I don't know why I said that. Habit, maybe. A lifetime of making things easier for her. What I found out later, and I only found this out because my nephew saw it and didn't know whether to tell me, and then decided I deserved to know, was that she had posted photos on her Instagram the entire weekend. Clear, bright photos. Her son building a sandcastle. Her husband with a local craft beer. A sunset over the water with a caption that said, disconnecting for a few days. No news, no drama, just us. No news, no drama. I lay in that hospital bed for a long time after my nephew told me that. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I didn't call her and scream the things I was thinking. I just lay there and felt something shift inside me, quietly, like furniture being moved in a room I'd lived in for 30 years. She arrived on the afternoon of the third day. She came in looking tired from the drive, and she hugged me carefully, the way you hug someone who is fragile, and she said she was so sorry. She felt terrible. She hadn't realized how serious it was. Her husband waited in the hall. Her son had stayed with his other grandparents in Calgary. I looked at her and I thought, I know you feel terrible. I also know that feeling terrible is not the same as being there. I didn't say that out loud. I said, I'm going to be fine. The doctors are pleased with how things are going. And she looked so relieved, so genuinely relieved, that I think she believed that was the end of it. She stayed 2 nights. She brought me magazines and a good hand lotion because hospitals dry your skin out. She was attentive and kind in the way she always could be when she was present, which is what made everything so hard to sort out in my own mind. She wasn't a cruel person. She was just absent, fundamentally, chronically absent in all the ways that matter. The night before she left to drive back, we had a conversation that I've thought about almost every day since. She said she wanted me to think seriously about moving to Calgary. She said this health scare, she called it a health scare, proved that I couldn't be alone in Kelowna anymore. She said they'd been looking at condos near them. Nice ones. She'd send me the listings. Her husband could help me sort out the house sale. I listened to all of this. Then I said, I'll think about it. She left the next morning looking satisfied. What I was actually thinking about was not condos in Calgary. I had a will in place, drafted right after Raymond died. It was straightforward. The house, my RRSP, Raymond's pension survivor benefit, a small life insurance policy. My daughter was the primary beneficiary of almost everything, with a portion going to charitable causes we both always supported. I had an appointment already scheduled with my lawyer for December to review it. something routine I'd set up in the spring. That appointment took on a different shape in my mind as I recovered at home through November. My nephew came every week. He'd bring groceries and ask what I actually needed, not what he assumed I needed. He fixed the broken step on my back deck that I'd been ignoring for a year. He sat with me some evenings and we'd watch old movies or just talk. He told me about his job, his girlfriend, a hiking trip he was planning. He treated me like a person, not a problem to be managed. There was also a woman from my church. I'll call her a friend now, though we'd only been acquaintances before, who started checking on me regularly. She'd lost her own husband recently, and we found we had a lot to say to each other about the particular loneliness of that. She brought soup. She made me laugh. She didn't once suggest I needed to be relocated. My daughter called. Not as often as those first weeks when she was still feeling the guilt of it. By December, she was back to once a week. The distracted phone calls, the mail sorting I could almost hear in the background. I kept my December appointment with my lawyer. I had a long conversation with him about what I actually wanted, not what was expected, not what was customary, but what reflected the truth of my life and the people in it. He is a practical man, and he didn't add commentary, which I appreciated. He just listened and took notes and said, "I'll have a new draft to you by the new year." In January, I signed it. My daughter doesn't know what's in it. I haven't told her. I don't intend to, not directly. But I want to write down what I decided for myself because I think it matters to say it plainly. I left my daughter a specific bequest. Not nothing. I'm not a vindictive person and I don't want to be remembered as one. But not the house, not the RRSP, not the life insurance. I left her my mother's china cabinet that she always said she liked and a sum of money that covered what I'd contributed to her education years ago, the student loan top-ups and the textbook money, which I'd never expected back but which felt like the right amount to name. An acknowledgement, not an inheritance. The house and the bulk of everything else goes to my nephew and to two charities Raymond and I always believed in, the food bank here in Kelowna and a women's shelter that does quiet, important work. There's a letter with the will. My lawyer has it sealed. My daughter will read it when the time comes. It's not a cruel letter. I worked on it for 3 weeks. I wanted it to say something true without being unkind, and I think I managed that, mostly. It says that I loved her, always, completely. It says that love and presence are different things and that I spent too many years confusing them. It says I hope she finds peace with it, and I mean that. Here's what I want to be clear about. For anyone listening to this, I didn't change my will out of anger. By the time I sat down with my lawyer, the anger had passed. What I felt was something quieter and more final than anger. It was clarity, a recognition that the story I'd been telling myself, that she just got busy, that she would show up when it really mattered, had been disproven, very simply by a set of facts. 31 calls. 31. The silence told me everything the years of phone calls hadn't. Last spring, I took a trip with my church friend to Prince Edward Island. It was something we'd both been saying we wanted to do and never quite got around to. We rented a little cottage outside Charlottetown for a week, and we drove around the island and ate too much seafood and laughed at things I can't even fully explain now. I posted one photo, just one, a picture of the red cliffs at dusk. My daughter called the next day. She said it looked wonderful. She said I seemed to be doing better. I said, I really am. I meant it both ways. My nephew got engaged last fall. He brought his girlfriend to meet me in August, and she is exactly right for him. Steady and funny and kind in the particular way he is kind. They're getting married in June, here in the Okanagan. I'm going to sit in the front row and I am not going to cry. I'm going to sit very still and feel the weight of all the love that made it to that room and be grateful for it. That is the lesson, if there is one. Not that family betrays you, though sometimes they do. Not that you should keep score, though the numbers do add up eventually. The lesson is simpler and harder than either of those things. It's that the people who show up in the ordinary moments, the Tuesday evenings, the broken back steps, The groceries left on the counter without being asked, those are your people, not the ones who appear when guilt or obligation calls them. I almost died in a church on a Sunday morning in October. The doctor tried 31 times to reach the person I had always assumed would be there. She was posting photos of the sunset. I woke up anyway, and I figured out slowly, lying in a hospital bed with a nurse I'd never met and a nephew who drove an hour without hesitating, what that was supposed to mean. I kept the house. I kept the garden boxes Raymond built. I had my nephew replant them in the spring, tomatoes, basil, a row of sweet peas along the fence that Raymond always liked. I am 64 years old, and I am, for the first time in a long time, not afraid of being a burden. I am not a burden. I am a person who almost died and then chose, very carefully, how to live. That choice looks different than I expected. Quieter in some ways, fuller in others. It turns out the life I wanted was already here. I just needed 31 unanswered calls to finally see it clearly. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes to live honestly. Not to perform honesty, not to talk about it over coffee with people who already agree with you, but to actually live it when it costs you something. What happened to me in that church, and in the hospital room afterward, and in the long, quiet weeks of recovery, forced me to ask whether I had been living honestly. And the answer, for a long time, was no. I had been living hopefully, which sounds like the same thing but isn't. Hope, the way I was practicing it, was a way of not looking directly at what was in front of me. I kept hoping my daughter would become someone she had never shown me evidence of being. That's not her failure. That's mine. The honest thing, the thing that took me 63 years and a cardiac event to finally do, was to look at the facts plainly and make decisions based on them. 31 calls, 3 days, a sunset photo. Those are facts. What I did with them, the new will, the quiet spring trip to the island, the tomatoes in Raymond's garden boxes, those were decisions. And the distance between a fact and a decision is where I think character actually lives. My nephew didn't show up because he was obligated to. He showed up because that's who he is. He has a kind of decency that isn't dramatic or loud about itself. He just does the thing, fixes the step, brings the groceries, stays the evening. I think that kind of quiet reliability is rarer than we acknowledge. We talk a lot about love as a feeling, but he showed me it's mostly a practice. You either practice it or you don't, and over time the evidence accumulates either way. My daughter isn't a bad person. I want to be clear about that. The same way I was clear about it in the letter I wrote for my lawyer to keep. She is distracted and absent, and she made choices that hurt me deeply. But I don't believe she's cruel. What she lacks, and what I spent too many years covering for, is the habit of paying attention to people outside her own immediate circle. That's a thing you can learn, if you decide to. She hasn't decided to yet. Maybe she will. I can't know that from here. What I know is that I had to stop making that my responsibility. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from holding space for someone else's potential growth at the expense of your own present life. I was tired in ways I hadn't admitted to myself. The hospital bed was the first place in years where I stopped trying to manage how she felt about things. Beverly, the woman from my congregation who rode in the ambulance with me and held my hand, she and I had lunch last month. We talked for 3 hours. She is funny and direct and has been through her own share of things she doesn't flinch from. I thought about what it means that a near stranger did more for me in one morning than my own daughter managed across 3 days. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it as a piece of information I've finally decided to act on. The life I have now is smaller in some ways. My circle is tighter, but it's real in a way my life wasn't before, and I think that's worth whatever it cost to get here. I almost didn't make it back. I'm glad I did. And I intend to use the time well. I was reaching for my reading glasses on the kitchen counter when my foot caught the edge of the bath mat. 1 second I was standing. The next I was on the linoleum, my right hip on fire, the kind of pain that doesn't let you breathe properly for the first few seconds. I just lay there, waiting for it to pass the way a bad cramp passes. It didn't pass. I called out, which was ridiculous because there was no one to hear me. I live alone in the house in Sudbury that my late husband Clifford and I bought in 1987, the year our son was born. The refrigerator hummed. The tap dripped the way it always has. Outside, a blue jay was making noise in the spruce tree by the fence. I couldn't get up. I tried twice and the pain was so sharp it made my vision go white at the edges. My phone was on the kitchen table, maybe 4 feet away, and it might as well have been in another province. I ended up pulling myself across the floor on my elbows, which took longer than I want to admit, and by the time I got to it, my hips were shaking and I was sweating through my shirt. I called 911. I told the woman on the line that I'd fallen and I couldn't get up, and I thought something was wrong with my hip. She kept me on the line until the paramedics arrived. They were kind. One of them, a young man with red hair, held my hand while the other one radioed ahead to the hospital. He told me I was going to be okay. I believed him because I needed to. The emergency room at Health Sciences North was busy for a Tuesday. I remember the ceiling tiles, the beeping, a woman somewhere behind a curtain crying softly. They told me I had a fracture. Not a minor one. I would need surgery. The nurse asked me if there was someone she could call. I gave her my son's number. His name is Warren. He's 41 years old, lives in Toronto with his wife and their 2 children, works in finance. I told the nurse his number from memory because I've had it memorized since he first got that phone. She came back 20 minutes later and told me she'd left a voicemail. That was fine. Sometimes he misses calls. He's busy, always busy. That's what I'd always told myself and everyone else who asked why he didn't visit more. He's very busy. He works hard. His wife keeps a full schedule. The kids have hockey, piano, swim lessons. I understood. I had always understood. They took me into surgery at around 6 in the evening. The last thing I asked the anesthesiologist before I went under was whether anyone had reached my son. She checked with someone at the desk and came back and said they were still trying. I woke up in recovery at 9:15 at night. My hip was wrapped. My mouth was dry. There was a television on a bracket near the ceiling playing the news with the volume off. The nurse who checked on me told me they'd called my son's number 14 times over the course of the afternoon and evening. 14. She said it gently, the way you say something when you already feel bad about having to say it at all. I thanked her and asked for some water. I didn't sleep much that first night. I lay there listening to the hospital sounds and I told myself there were explanations. His phone died. He was in a meeting that ran long. He was somewhere without signal. The drive from Toronto to Sudbury is 4 hours on a good day. I wasn't expecting him to appear at my bedside. I just wanted to know he knew. My neighbor Claudette came the next morning. She's 73, a retired school teacher, and she'd seen the ambulance and tracked me down to the hospital's main line, which tells you something about neighbors and something about sons. She brought me a cardigan from my house because she knows the hospitals here run cold, and she sat with me for 3 hours. We didn't talk much. We didn't have to. She was the one who told me, carefully, the way she would have told a student something difficult, that she'd tried to reach Warren herself. She'd found his number in the address book I keep by the phone. She has a key to my house for emergencies, and she'd called him the evening before and again that morning. Voicemail both times. I looked out the window at the parking lot. A man was helping an elderly woman into a car, steadying her elbow. I watched until they drove away. The nurses were wonderful. I want to say that clearly because what came next had nothing to do with them, and everything to do with them, and everything to do with the fact that they kept trying. By the time 48 hours had passed, the hospital had made 23 attempts to reach my son. 23. A nurse named Gail told me this almost apologetically, as if it were somehow her failure rather than his. I told her she'd done everything right. On the 3rd day, my daughter-in-law called, not Warren, his wife Tiffany. She called the hospital directly, which meant she'd had to look up the number and make an effort. So I suppose I should note that. She asked how I was doing in a voice that was performing concern without quite feeling it, and I told her I'd had surgery and I was in recovery and I'd been trying to reach Warren. She said he'd been caught up. She didn't say with what. She said he sent his love. I asked to speak with him. She said he was in a meeting. I said I'd had hip surgery. She said she understood and she'd have him call me as soon as he was free. He didn't call that day. Or the next. What happened instead? And I didn't find this out until later, until Claudette showed me, which is its own story, was that on the day of my surgery, while I was lying on an operating table in Sudbury, my son and his wife were in Banff, Alberta, a long weekend at the Fairmont. His wife had posted photographs on her Instagram account, which I don't have, but Claudette's granddaughter does, and she had pulled them up for Claudette at the kitchen table, and Claudette had screenshot them. There was one of the two of them at dinner, candlelight, wine. There was one of the mountains, golden hour, clearly taken from a gondola. There was one of the hotel room, a gift basket on the bed, a caption that said, "Taking space. No interruptions." Just the two of us, finally. The timestamp on that last one was 6:47 in the evening. I had come out of surgery at 9:15. I looked at those photos for a long time. My reading glasses were on my face, and I was sitting up in my hospital bed, and I looked at the mountains and the wine and the gift basket, and I thought about the word interruptions and what it meant that I was one of them. Claudette didn't say anything. She just put her hand over mine on the blanket. I asked her when Warren had posted anything about Banff on his own account. She said he hadn't. He'd kept quiet on social media while his wife documented their uninterrupted time away. Whether that was guilt or just his habit, I couldn't say. I'm not sure it mattered. He called on the 5th day. I was doing physio in the hallway, learning to take small steps with a walker, and the nurse brought me my phone and I stopped and answered it. His voice was the voice I'd known for 41 years, my son's voice, and for a second my chest did something complicated. He asked how I was. I told him I'd had surgery, that the hospital had been trying to reach him for days, that I'd been alone. He said he was sorry, he hadn't had great reception, the mountains can be spotty, he'd had the phone on silent for some work things, he felt terrible, he really did. I listened to him explain. I thought about 23 calls, I thought about no interruptions. I thought about the 40 minutes I'd spent on the kitchen floor pulling myself toward a phone. I said, "Warren, it's all right." Because what else do you say? You don't have that fight from a hospital hallway holding a walker, 3 days post-surgery, 67 years old. You just don't. You file it somewhere quiet inside yourself, and you say it's all right, and you let him tell you he'll drive up soon. He didn't come that weekend. Something came up with the kid's schedule. He came 3 weeks later on a Sunday and stayed for 4 hours and spent at least 45 minutes of that on his phone in the kitchen while I sat in the living room in the recliner my neighbor Claudette had helped me set up because it was easier on the hip than the couch. His wife didn't come. She sent a grocery store flower arrangement with his mother written on the card. I watched my son in my kitchen through the doorway talking on his phone, and I tried to remember the last time he'd come on his own, without a reason, without the kids for Easter or the obligatory Christmas run. I couldn't place it. It was years. More than a few. Clifford died 6 years ago. Heart attack quick, which was a mercy. After that, I had rattled around in this house alone and told myself it was fine, because Warren was a phone call away and I still had my garden and Claudette next door and my book club on Thursday nights. I had made myself small enough that I wouldn't be a burden. I had learned not to need things. I had learned this so well that when I needed my son, and I called, and the hospital called, 23 times, the message that got through to him was, no interruptions. I came home from the hospital after 8 days. Claudette picked me up. She had stocked my fridge, put a non-slip mat in the bathroom, moved a few things lower in the cupboard so I wouldn't have to reach. My son had sent a text, "So glad you're home, Mum. Let me know if you need anything." I held the phone for a moment. Then I put it face down on the table. Over the next few weeks, I did a lot of sitting. Healing from a hip fracture at 67 means you are mostly still, which means you think more than you might want to. I thought about the life I had built in this house, the 37 years in these walls, Clifford's workbench still in the garage, the garden I kept going every summer because it had been hours together and I couldn't let it go. I thought about what I was keeping it for. I had told myself for a long time that I was keeping everything for Warren, that this house, the modest RRSP I'd been careful with, the small life insurance policy I'd kept current, that all of it was for him, that it was my job to hold things together so that something would be there for my son when the time came, that this was what good mothers did. I had a will. I'd had one since Clifford died, updated twice since then. My estate lawyer is a woman I'll call Ms. F., a practical, sharp woman in her late 50s who had always been more direct with me than I sometimes wanted. She'd called the house to check on me, which I hadn't expected, and when I mentioned that I'd been doing some thinking, she asked if I wanted to come in. I went in on a Thursday, Claudette driving me, the week after I'd graduated from the walker to a cane. I sat across from Ms. F. and I told her what had happened. Not defensively, not dramatically. Just the facts of it. The fall. The surgery. The 23 calls. The Banff photos. The 4-hour visit 3 weeks later. The text message. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "What do you want to do?" I thought about it. I really thought about it. Sitting in that chair across from her, with the afternoon light coming through the window and the sound of downtown Sudbury outside. I said, I don't want to leave the house to someone who treats it like an obligation he hasn't gotten around to yet. She nodded. She didn't offer me platitudes. I appreciated that. We talked for an hour about what a revised will would look like, about the fact that in Ontario, a parent has no legal obligation to leave assets to an adult child, regardless of what that child expects or assumes, about the difference between what I owed my son and what I'd chosen to give him, about the organizations I had given my time to over the years, the women's shelter where I'd volunteered for a decade, the library fund, a scholarship through the local community foundation for first-generation university students, the kind of student I'd once been myself. I left her office with an appointment to return and sign a new document. I drove home, sat in my recliner, and called Warren. He answered on the second ring. I told him I wanted him to know that I had updated my will. I told him the house would be sold when I passed, and the proceeds would go to a small number of charities. I told him I had left him a specific and particular amount, enough to be meaningful, not enough to be an inheritance he'd been banking on. There was a silence on the line. Then he said, "Mom, I don't understand." I said, "I think you do." He said I was being emotional, that he'd explained about the reception in Banff, that it wasn't fair to make a major decision like this based on one bad situation, that he had a family now, responsibilities, a mortgage, 2 kids and extracurriculars, and he'd always assumed that this would eventually come to him, that he and Tiffany had built their plans around. I let him talk. When he finished, I said, "Warren, I love you. I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because I spent 40 minutes on that kitchen floor alone and 8 days in a hospital where the nurses knew my name better than my own son did, and somewhere in those 8 days, I understood something I should have understood sooner." He said, "What's that?" I said, "That I spent a very long time making myself easy to overlook, and I'm done doing that now." He was quiet again. He came up the following weekend. Without Tiffany, which was different. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee I made, and he looked at me in a way he hadn't looked at me in years, like he was actually seeing me, this particular woman, rather than a category labeled mother that he got around to when he could. We talked for a long time, really talked, not the surface version. I told him things I should have said years ago about how isolated I'd felt since Clifford died, about how I'd trained myself to need nothing so as not to be a bother. He told me things too, about pressure he was under at work, about his marriage not being what it looked like on the outside, about a kind of numbness he'd been living inside that he hadn't told anyone about. I am not naive. I know that conversation doesn't fix 23 unanswered calls. It doesn't undo the gift basket photo or the word interruptions. And I didn't change the will back. Miss F. had helped me understand that what I built should go towards something that reflects what I actually valued in my life, and that is not the same thing as what my son had come to assume was owed to him. But something shifted between us that Sunday afternoon in the kitchen. I don't know what it amounts to yet. I am 67 years old, and I have learned not to invest too heavily in the feeling that things have changed until I see whether they have. I listed the house in March. I had already found a 2-bedroom apartment in a building with an elevator, a community room, a garden plot I can tend in the summer, and 2 other women on my floor who I have already had coffee with twice. Claudette is 10 minutes away by car. Ms. F is a 15-minute drive. The women's shelter where I still volunteer is 4 blocks. I don't need 4 bedrooms and Clifford's workbench and the memory of a life built for 2 and then quietly halved. Warren texted when he heard the house was listed. He said he was surprised. I texted back that I understood and that I hoped he would be okay. He was. He will be. He's 41 years old with a job and a house and children who have hockey and piano and swim lessons. He will be fine. I think about that kitchen floor sometimes. The humming refrigerator. The blue jay. The 4 feet between me and my phone. I don't think about it with bitterness. Or I try not to, on the days it creeps in. I think about it as the thing that made me stop pretending. Stop organizing my whole existence around being easy to ignore. If you are listening to this and you are somewhere in the middle of what I've described, not the fall maybe, but the feeling of it, the slow revelation that you have become optional to someone you were not optional to, I want to say this directly. You're allowed to revise the story. You are allowed to look at what you've been holding and who you've been holding it for and decide it belongs somewhere else now. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to need things. It is not too late to stop making yourself small. It took me 40 minutes on a cold kitchen floor and 23 unanswered calls to understand that. I hope it costs you less. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that Thursday in March when I signed the new documents in Ms. F's office. Not the dramatic, movie version of cause and effect, the quiet, accumulated kind. The kind where nothing looks like a decision until suddenly it is. Warren didn't become someone who doesn't answer his phone in a single moment. And I didn't become someone who makes herself invisible overnight either. These things built slowly, the way sediment builds. Layer by layer, each one so thin you don't notice it while it's settling. He learned that I would be fine because I always said I was fine. I learned to say I was fine because I didn't want to be a burden. And somewhere in that arrangement, we both stopped being honest, and we both paid for it. Just differently. That's the thing about cause and effect that nobody tells you clearly enough when you're younger. The consequences don't always arrive loudly. Sometimes they arrive as a kitchen floor at 7 in the morning and 40 minutes alone and 23 calls that go nowhere. Sometimes they arrive as a photograph of mountains and a caption about no interruptions. The bill comes eventually. It just doesn't always look like a bill when it does. I don't think Warren is a bad person. I've turned that question over many times since that Sunday afternoon when he sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me things he'd never said out loud before. What I think is that he became someone who had learned to take me for granted, partly because I had taught him it was safe to do so. That's a hard thing to admit. It doesn't excuse him, but it's true, and I've found that the truth, even the uncomfortable kind, is more useful to me than a clean story where I'm only ever the wronged party. What I've come to understand, and I say this as someone who's spent a long time confusing endurance with strength, is that real resilience isn't about surviving quietly. It's about being honest enough with yourself to see what isn't working, and then having the courage to change it even when it costs you something. Revising the will cost me something. Listing the house cost me something. Telling Warren directly on the phone without softening it or apologizing for it, that cost me something too. But the alternative was to keep paying a different kind of cost, the invisible daily one, the one where you slowly disappear inside your own life and call it being low maintenance. Claudette, who has been my neighbor for 19 years and knows me better than most, said something to me a few weeks after I came home from the hospital. She said, "You've always been the strongest person in every room you walk into. You just forgot to act like it." I didn't know what to say to that. I just sat with it. I'm sitting with it still, and slowly, I think, I'm starting to act like it. The day my son-in-law's father tried to humiliate me in front of 240 people, I was wearing the same navy dress I'd worn to my retirement dinner 14 years earlier. I remember thinking as he raised his glass and turned toward me with that particular smile, the kind men like him practice in mirrors, that the dress still fit. That's what my mind landed on. The dress still fit, and his face was about to change forever. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's always been my problem. My mother used to say I told stories backwards, starting with the fire and working my way to the match. So let me go back. Let me go back to where it actually started, which is a parking lot in Sudbury, Ontario in November of 1987, with a 2-year-old on my hip and $17 in my checking account. His name was Joel, my son's father. He wasn't a bad man exactly, just the kind of man who needed to be somewhere else more than he needed to be with us. He left on a Tuesday. I remember because the recycling went out on Tuesdays, and I put it at the end of the driveway that morning, not knowing that by evening there would be a note on the kitchen counter and a half-empty closet upstairs. He took his work boots and his Les Miserables cassette tape. He left the boy. My son was 22 months old. His name was Callum. No, wait, I said I'd call people by their relationships. He's my son. That's what matters. I had 2 years of nursing college behind me and a license that needed renewing. My mother lived in Timmins, 4 hours north, and she offered to take us in. I thought about it for 3 days. Then I called the hospital in Sudbury and asked if they were hiring. They were. I won't pretend the next 15 years were easy because they weren't. And I've reached an age where I'm done pretending things were easier than they were just to make other people comfortable. I worked double shifts through most of the 90s. I missed school concerts. I missed Halloween 3 years running because someone always called in sick on the pediatric ward on October 31st, and I was the one who always answered. My son learned to make his own lunches at age 7. He learned to set his own alarm at 8. By 11, he was doing a load of laundry a week, folding everything neatly because I told him that was just what people in this house did. We didn't complain. We didn't have the energy for it. What we had was Saturday mornings. Every Saturday that I wasn't on shift, no exceptions, we made pancakes. Not from a box, from scratch, the way my grandmother taught me, with a splash of vanilla and the tiniest pinch of nutmeg that you'd never be able to identify, but you'd definitely notice if it was missing. My son would sit on the counter. Even when he got too big for it, he still sat on the counter. And we'd talk, really talk, about school, about friends, about whatever he was reading. He was always reading. I was proud of that. He grew up kind. That was the thing I was most proud of, more than the engineering degree, more than the job in Halifax, more than any of it. He was genuinely, quietly kind. The sort of person who holds the elevator without making a production of it. He called me in April, about 3 years ago now, to tell me he'd met someone. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard before. Lighter, somehow, like something he'd been carrying had been set down. I asked her name and he said it. Waverly. Waverly. Ashgrove Pit. He laughed a little when he said it, like he still couldn't quite believe someone with a name like that had chosen to be with him. I told him it was a beautiful name. I meant it. I didn't meet her until Thanksgiving. She drove up with him to my place in Sudbury. I moved back years ago. Funny how that works. And she was exactly what I'd hoped for, and also nothing like what I'd imagined. She was quieter than I expected, thoughtful. She helped with the dishes without being asked, and then asked intelligent questions about nursing, genuinely curious, not the polite version of curious. I liked her. I also noticed, and I filed this away without making much of it at the time, that she deflected every question about her own family. Not rudely, smoothly, the way people do when they've had a lot of practice. Her parents lived in Calgary. Her father ran some kind of real estate development company. Her mother had mentioned this to my son once, apparently, but Waverly herself never brought it up. My son said they were not that close. I didn't press. Families are complicated. I know that better than most. The engagement happened on a Tuesday, different feeling entirely. My son sent a photo of the ring before he even called. She was laughing in the photo, really laughing, her head thrown back. It's still in my phone. The wedding was planned for the following September in Halifax at a venue that looked like a converted historic building, which I later learned it was an old waterfront warehouse that had been done up beautifully. $400,000 went into that renovation, according to the local Heritage Board website. I know that because her father mentioned the renovation approximately 9 times over the course of the weekend. His name was, I'll call him the father of my son-in-law. That's what he was. He was a tall man, the kind of tall that comes with a certain ease in the world, like doors open for you partly because you expect them to. He had the handshake of someone who had been told his whole life that his handshake communicated character. The first time I met him at the rehearsal dinner, he looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture that you're trying to decide whether to keep. His wife, my son-in-law's mother, was perfectly pleasant, a little distant. She asked me twice what I did before retirement, and both times when I said nursing, she said, "How wonderful," and moved on. I don't think she meant anything by it. I think she genuinely didn't know what to say. There were 240 guests. The ceremony was in a waterfront space with tall windows, and the reception followed in the same building, the table set with the kind of floral arrangements that take up more room than the people sitting next to them. My son looked like he was going to float away from happiness. My daughter-in-law was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the dress, though the dress was extraordinary. I had been seated at a table 2 rows back from the head table. Not at the head table. I want you to understand what that means, because I spent some time understanding it myself. My son is an only child. I am his only parent. His grandmother, my mother, had passed 4 years earlier, so I was it. I was the entirety of his family side. And I was at a table 2 rows back between a colleague of my son-in-law's named something I've since forgotten and a great-aunt of Waverley's who was lovely but quite hard of hearing. I told myself it was a seating chart miscommunication. I told myself a lot of things that weekend that I later had to revise. The speeches began after dinner. My son-in-law's father stood up first. This is not traditional. It is typically the father of the bride. But the father of my son-in-law was not a man who waited for tradition when he could simply proceed. He had a microphone, even though the room did not really require one. He told 3 stories about his son that were all more about himself than about his son. He mentioned his company twice. He made a joke that landed the way jokes land when the person telling them has always had an audience. Then he turned to the room, glass raised, and he said, "My son has chosen a remarkable woman, and of course—" And here he paused, and he looked at me, specifically at me, with that practiced smile. Every groom brings his own history to a marriage, his own background. Another pause. We are so glad that Waverley's warmth and her family's values will be such a strong foundation going forward. He raised his glass. 240 people raised theirs. I sat with my hands in my lap and I breathed, slowly, the way I'd learned to breathe in the ICU during the worst moments, when breathing was the only thing you could control. I understood exactly what had been said. The room understood too, or at least the parts of the room that were paying attention. My son's face had gone still. My daughter-in-law's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. Her mother stared at the table. And I thought, not tonight, not at my son's wedding, not with his joy in the room. So I put my napkin on the table, and I stood up. My son saw me first. His eyes went wide. I gave him the smallest shake of my head. "It's all right. I'm all right. Trust me." And I looked at the man still holding his glass, and I said clearly, in a voice that 30 years on a hospital ward had made very comfortable with being heard in difficult moments, "I'd like to say a few words. If you don't mind." There was a small silence, the kind that has weight. Someone near the back laughed nervously. The father of my son-in-law gestured with his glass in a way that was meant to seem magnanimous. I didn't have a microphone. I didn't need one. My son was 22 months old when I became a single parent, I said. I won't tell you that story tonight because tonight is about him and about Waverley, and they deserve better than my history. But I will say this. I looked at my son. Just him, for a moment. You learned to fold laundry at 7 years old. You learned to set an alarm at 8. You made your own lunches before most of your classmates had stopped asking their mothers to cut the crusts off their sandwiches. You did this because that was our life, and you never once, not once, made me feel ashamed of it. You made me proud every single day. My son was crying. He doesn't cry easily, and he was crying. Waverly, I said, turning to her, and she looked at me with something that cracked open in my chest a little. You are loved. Not by a family with a history of, values and foundations. I said it gently, no edge, just a small breath of it. You are loved by a man who learned to love people well before he had any reason to believe the world would love him back. That is rare. I hope you know how rare it is. I raised my glass, the water glass, because I'd hardly touched the wine, and I said to the two of you. 240 people raised their glasses. This time the room felt different. I sat down. The great-aunt beside me patted my hand and said in a voice that carried, "Good girl." She was 83 years old and I could have kissed her. What happened after is the part people ask about when my son tells this story at dinner parties, which apparently he does, though I only know this because my daughter-in-law called me once and said, "Did you know you're his favorite story?" Which I am choosing to take as a compliment. What happened was this. After the reception, after the dancing, after my son carried his wife out into the Halifax night, her laughing and him careful with the dress, Waverly's mother found me by the coat check. She had been crying, though she'd fixed her makeup. She said to me, "He's been like that his whole life. I'm sorry. I want you to know that I'm sorry." I told her it wasn't her apology to make. She said, "I know. I'm making it anyway." Then she told me something that changed the shape of the evening. She told me that 12 years ago, her husband's company had been involved in a development project outside Edmonton, a residential build. There had been structural issues that had been flagged by the site inspector and then not corrected. Quietly, not corrected. There had been a settlement with 3 families. There were documents, non-disclosure agreements, which, she said, with a careful precision that told me she had been holding this information for a very long time, do not legally prevent the person who signed them from speaking to a journalist acting in the public interest. She pressed a name and a phone number into my hand. A journalist with the Calgary Herald. I looked at the paper. I looked at her. "He'll do it again," she said quietly. "He's already planning another project. A bigger one. I can't stop him." But I thought perhaps the right person should have that name. I put the paper in my evening bag. I want to be honest about what came next, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story worth telling. The next 18 months were not simple. There were conversations with a journalist. There were conversations with a lawyer. Mine, a woman in Sudbury who'd handled my mother's estate and who turned out to have exactly the right contacts in Alberta. There were the 3 families from the Edmonton project who had moved on with their lives, but who, when contacted, were willing to talk on record. There was the story, which ran in the Herald on a Thursday in March and was picked up by the CBC the following Monday. There was the investigation. I wasn't in the room for any of the significant moments. I made phone calls. I passed along a name. The thing you learn in 30 years of nursing is that the right intervention at the right moment is more powerful than any amount of force applied at the wrong one. My son-in-law called me when the story broke. He was shaken. He wanted to know if I'd known at the wedding. I told him the truth. I hadn't known anything specific, only that something was wrong. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mum called you Mum in her head from the rehearsal dinner. She told me that once. I thought you should know." I had to put the phone down for a minute after that. The wedding was 26 months ago. Since then, my daughter-in-law and I have had Sunday phone calls almost every week. She tells me about her work. She's a physical therapist, very good at it, and I tell her about my garden, which I have taken up with an enthusiasm that surprises me. Last spring, she drove up to Sudbury for a long weekend without my son, just the 2 of us, and we planted tomatoes, and she told me about her childhood in a way she hadn't before. Slowly, testing the words like ice, she wasn't sure would hold. I listened. That's what I had to offer. I knew how to listen. The father of my son-in-law stepped down from his company in June after the regulatory findings came through. I don't know what his life looks like now. I don't spend much time thinking about it. What I think about is this. Last Thanksgiving, the whole family came to Sudbury. My son cooked the turkey. Badly. Honestly, he's a wonderful man who cannot cook turkey, and his wife made her grandmother's Yorkshire pudding because her family's half British, and I made the pancakes. Not for breakfast, for dessert, with maple syrup and a little whipped cream, because that's what my son requested, and you don't argue with a grown man about pancakes on Thanksgiving. He sat on the counter to watch me make them. He's 38 years old, and he sat on the counter. Some things you just keep. I'm not a person who believed in grand gestures. I believed in showing up. I believed in double shifts and Saturday mornings and letting people tell their stories at their own pace. I believed in writing down a phone number when someone pressed it into your hand and trusting that the right moment would come. I raised my son alone. I am not ashamed of a single day of it. And I will tell you something I have only recently let myself say out loud. I did a good job. Not a perfect job, a good one, and he turned out kind. In the end, that's all I was trying to do. Raise someone who would hold the elevator without making a production of it. I think I managed. People ask me sometimes if I regret standing up that night. Not the journalist, not the phone calls, not any of it. Just that moment in the reception hall when I pushed back my chair and found my voice in front of 240 strangers. I never know quite how to answer that because regret requires imagining a version of yourself who stayed seated, and I can't find her anymore. I'm not sure she ever really existed. What I've come to understand. Slowly, the way you understand most things that actually matter is that a life lived with integrity doesn't protect you from being treated badly. It just means that when someone tries to diminish you, they're working against something real, something built. And things that are genuinely built tend to hold. I spent 30 years doing work that required me to show up fully every shift, regardless of how I felt or what was happening at home. That kind of consistency either breaks you or it becomes the truest thing about you. For me, it became the truest thing. And when my son's father-in-law stood up in that beautiful Halifax room and implied, as elegantly as he could manage, that my son and I were less than, that our history was something to be managed rather than celebrated, he was measuring me against a version of dignity that had nothing to do with what I actually know dignity to be. Dignity, in my experience, is not about the venue or the floral arrangements or whether you're seated at the head table. It's about whether you've earned the right to speak the truth quietly and have it land. I had earned that. 30 years of double shifts and Saturday morning pancakes and letting my son cry when he needed to and pushing him forward when he didn't think he could go, that was my credential. No one could take it. What happened to the father of my son-in-law happened because of his own choices, made over many years, pressed down into the foundation of buildings that were never as solid as he told people they were. I didn't cause his downfall. I only passed a name on a piece of paper to someone who knew what to do with it. The weight of what he'd done was already there. It was always going to come down eventually. That's not a philosophy or a belief system. It's just how accountability works when enough people stop looking the other way. What I want to say to anyone listening who is in the middle of a life that looks from the outside like not quite enough. You're building something. Every day you show up when it would be easier not to. Every time you choose honesty over comfort or your child's future over your own convenience, you are building something that no one can assess from across a reception hall. They can't see it from where they're standing, but it's there. And one day, in a room full of people, it will hold you up when someone tries to bring you down. It will hold you up without you even having to ask it to. My son sat on my kitchen counter at 38 years old to watch me make pancakes. That's the whole story, really. Everything else is just details.